Hello. Hi. First drafts are the vein of my existence. Listen. I know there are writers, I know personally writers who adore first drafts. They're like the favorite part of their writing journey. And I get it to an extent. It's about just letting the words, what the fuck? Letting the words, I can't pronounce it. It's about letting the words flow. It's about discovering who these people are, who these characters are, how do they interact with each other, how do they speak, what do they want, what is this world, what is the story, it's creativity at its peak. You may know what you're doing if you're a planner, but for me, I don't know what I'm doing the majority of the time, which is fucking horrible. Okay, listen. I really dislike first drafts because they make me feel that I can't write. Even though I have a finished product here, when I'm writing a first draft now, because I'm writing a new story, it still makes me feel like I don't remember how I'm supposed to write. How are these words supposed to go together? How did this theme supposed to work? Character consistency? What is that? Oh god, I don't know. I don't like first drafts. But I love rewriting. That's my favorite part. When I get to sit down and just do it all over, but now with a clearer roadmap. Oh, that's perfect. That's great. Because the first draft is never what you want your story to be. Generally speaking, maybe there are people who can just get it first try, but most people cannot. So it's more so like a sketch. That's how I like to say. It's a sketch. I'm filling my sandbox with sand. And later, I can start building castles out of it. And I have to really convince myself that it's fine to let the first draft be bad. The point is that it should exist, not that it's good. I sometimes like to go back to my first drafts and just compare. Just to see how far I've come in a specific story. And I thought it would be fun to do that today also. I thought it would be really interesting to compare the first chapter of this book, its first draft, and the current draft. I cannot say which draft it is because any writer can tell you that the first chapter gets rewritten a million times. So you just keep working on it over and over and over until it all just starts to blur together and I don't know on which draft of this first draft I'm on. What the fuck did I just say? I don't know which draft this first chapter is on. Let's just say draft 6. I don't know. Yeah. I have both first chapters here. I printed them out, although I'm gonna put them on the screen here somewhere, just so you can see what I'm reading. And first, some statistics comparison. So, the first chapter, it's 19 pages long and 5,697 words. Whereas the newest first chapter is 14 pages long and it's 3,946 words long, which is a difference of around 1,700 words, which is a lot. Because you would assume that if I cut down so many words, I'm cutting out information. But actually, the opposite happened. I looked through it, and it's really interesting how much I've added whilst removing. Okay, so let's compare the first page. Okay, the beginning. Quill's first thought was, the air's so cold. His second thought was, wait, the dead don't breathe. His third thought, bubbling up after a significant pause, was, well, this didn't go entirely to plan. I still like this opening, I will say. I think it's fun. I think it's voicey. I think it kind of gives you immediately the vibe of what's going on. So first, the main character. He knows that he's supposed to be dead, and yet he realizes that he is not dead, and we also learn that he planned to be dead. 3 sentences, a lot of information is given. And I like this beginning. I think it's fun, but I did remove it in some time later, and I will explain why in a bit. But first, let's just get down one more paragraph, because it kind of like this beginning, I reworked it in a different way. And I want to show you what I mean. Unrest was rumbling around him, vague sounds and sensations mixing into one pool of nondescript buzzing, but Quill couldn't bring himself to pay it any attention. He was more concerned with the idea that perhaps the dead did breathe and all the implications that came along with it. They'd been burying their deceased under heaps of dirt in tiny wooden coffins, and, if he knew his physics, their supply of air would run out in mere hours. What then? Could they die again and the process would repeat? If so, well, that'd be rather morbid. Perhaps one day someone would figure it out and install little tubes connecting the graves to the outside world. They'd probably get an award for that too, for saving the dead from dying. Truly, what a hero they'd be to all those poor corpses. All of this was to avoid thinking about the much more likely possibility regarding his sudden ability to fill his lungs with that cold air. Eventually, when Quill's constructed thesis paper on the topic was beginning to sound ridiculous even to him, he had to admit that, if the dead did breathe, they would have realized it by now, which could only mean one thing: he wasn't dead. This was a bit embarrassing on his end. Despite everything, he rarely messed up, so to not get something this basic right was rather unbecoming of him. So it's not... I wouldn't say it's bad, but it's very, very wordy. Like, what am I getting from this? It's the beginning of the first chapter. You want to catch the reader's attention from the start. And this is just a bit too wordy, right? Because what information are we getting from this? I don't know. Wait, I should have thought about this. Like, essentially, we're getting that Quill overthinks things a lot. Mentions thesis papers, so he's something of a scientist, perhaps. He's kind of like has a dry narration style, and despite everything, he rarely messed up, so not to get something this basic right was rather unbecoming of him. So this kind of implies that he not only planned to die, but that was his intention with whatever he did. You might think he killed himself. You would assume he probably killed himself from this, which is not what happened. So it's a bit misleading, and I don't want to mislead the readers from the first paragraphs, right? And to compare it to the new version, it should be noted that, despite popular belief, consciousness does not persist into the afterlife. A common misconception, really. Spirits appear to act with intention, and so people often attribute a personality to them. A better way for a person to handle the prospect of death, perhaps. Few are attracted to the idea of inevitable nothingness. Whilst the mechanisms behind spirits' behavioral patterns are hardly understood, a person's living consciousness could not have an effect on their spirit post-mortem, because consciousness is nothing more than complex neural activity, which a spirit notably lacks. Nothing more implies neurology simple, which it certainly is not, but in the context of magical phenomena, anything that bends to the established laws of nature is regarded as rather elementary. All that to say, this created a paradox. Quill was dead, and yet he could not be, for thought was impossible in death. A troubling dilemma. So this has been a bit of a controversial change. I start again with not the character, but sort of some philosophical musings, perhaps. I don't know how I would word it. Some people really liked it, some people didn't, so I think it's rather subjective. I liked it, so I'm keeping it the way that it is for now. And I will explain why. So here, we are getting the same idea that Quill is very analytical, right? He is quite rational and has leaning towards science. And it sort of gives world building, which then immediately is used to establish the character's situation. So Quill was dead, and yet he could not be, for that was impossible in death. So that's kind of like how he arrived at that conclusion, by thinking about what he knows of, well, living and death. So I feel like it kind of gets across the same idea that he, again, overthinks things and is very analytical, but it's more presented in a more succinct way. Now, I wanted to also compare a little bit more because this is very similar, but it's presented in a bit of a different way. So after this was a bit embarrassing, he thinks, no. If he was certain of anything, it was that he had died. He could still feel it deep within, a lingering trace of the chill of death, slowly thawing away, but there nonetheless. So, no, he hadn't failed in that regard at least. What a joy. Distantly, a voice that sounded a lot like his mother's berated him for his nonchalance, but frankly, emoting right now sounded exhausting. Okay, again, this is about more so establishing his voice. Again, establishing his voice. I don't know what I'm doing with this first draft. I'm just throwing shit at the wall. But it's kind of like, okay, so he hadn't failed in that regard, at least implying that he is prone to failing, which is contradictory to what I just said before, despite everything he rarely messed up. So it's kind of like, so does he, okay, so he messes up, but also he doesn't mess up. It's kind of contradictory, so it's kind of like, again, first drafts, it's messy. And remarks that he feels exhausted and you cannot be bothered to emote right now. Now compare it to the current draft. So I start with the same kind of beginning as at the beginning of this first draft. Unrest was rumbling around him. Here it's a bit later, but it starts in a similar way. Unrest grazed his comprehension, vague sounds and feelings melting into one nondescript buzzing. Perhaps his education had failed him, and this was what the afterlife was truly like, death bastardizing the sensations of life, but no, death had been nothing. Even now, a chill of it lingered within, slowly thawing. Death was without sound, without feeling, and crucially, without breath. So in these couple of sentences, I said almost the exact same thing as I said in this entire couple of paragraphs. How maybe he didn't know how death actually was like, and maybe his education failed him, but no, death was real and he felt it. So I communicate the same information in a more condensed way without really losing any meaning. And then afterwards, yet cold air rushed into his lungs, stinging his tongue and teeth. Not dead then. Sincerely, what the fuck? So this line here, sincerely, what the fuck, is kind of like the punchline of this entire page. So we established that Quill is very analytical, he is rational, he has a science-focused mind. So, and I established his kind of formal speaking manner. And then I add, sincerely, what the fuck, right? So it's kind of like, that's why I include those first two paragraphs about spirits' behavioral patterns or whatever the fuck, just so that when I deliver that what the fuck line, it kind of hits more. So, and I feel like that kind of, this whole page establishes his voice quicker and in a more kind of tighter way without, losing that voice. And just, it's kind of more, again, focused, right? So that's kind of the very, very beginning. Now, Quill is at this moment kind of only partly conscious, and we need him to wake up so that the action can start, right? And just to compare how long it takes for him to wake up in draft 1 versus the current draft, it just keeps going, right? It just keeps going about how exhausted he is, how he wished he could sleep but he can't, and he doesn't know what to do because he could not wake up and yet he could not fall asleep. And then I add this part where he knew that he did die, he wasn't sure how it happened, the exact circumstances around what did happen escaped him. So I just kind of he can't remember at this point in time what happened around his death. And it's something that I removed very quickly on because it's not relevant. He doesn't suffer from amnesia. I added this here so that I could avoid talking about the circumstances behind his death, right? I wanted to keep that mystery going for a little while. But later I realized it's really not necessary Because in the first chapter, you want to confuse your readers a little bit, but you don't want to confuse them so much that they have no idea what the fuck is going on, because then it's kind of hard to keep reading. So I do want to give the readers enough information for them to form a basic understanding of what the story is going to be about. So I don't want to use these tricks of like, oh, he has amnesia, so I can't talk about what happened. That's something I remove like very quickly on, and especially in this one, because he very quickly wakes up here. Sincerely, what the fuck? He remarks how he's very exhausted, but his consciousness persisted, and he's not going under. And very quickly, if he was awake, it's to reason he could at the very least open his eyes. So he did. So he just wakes us up. And now we get finally to some action. Well, I say action, it's just things are moving along, right? Now we immediately get introduced to a new character. So this is how it sounds like in the first draft. Oh, good, so you can wake, a voice to his right sounded, grating far too loud, and one that made Quill want to close his eyes again and pretend he couldn't actually. Coma was the more likely outcome, you see. But of course, you're not the kind of person to stay in one, aren't you? It doesn't, I don't know, like, it's just kind of weird. It's a weird thing to say, I think. Like, I just look at his eyes and they're like, you could have stayed in the coma, but you didn't because you're not the kind of, like, it's just kind of weird. It's just kind of weird. So, I replace it with something far simpler, but that would read more realistically. Ah, you can wake, that's good, a voice to his right said, grating far too loud, and Quill considered closing his eyes again and pretending he couldn't. Can you hear me? If the coma was a more likely outcome, they don't know his level of consciousness, so establishing that is more important at this present time. Then I just get a description of the person. It's kind of similar, just reworded in a different way, so I'm not gonna bore you with that. Then kind of the conversation, it's one-sided, but it kind of goes on in a similar way. How are you feeling? Can you speak? Do you know who I am? Do you know who you are? And he doesn't answer any of these questions, and she says, have it your way, once you're ready to talk, we will. That is pretty similar to what happens in this new draft. Only it's just less words, right? It doesn't have to have a lot of words here, because he's just kind of like, oh no. Like, he recognizes her immediately, and he's very upset by it. Now, I have a problem with vagueness. I like to leave a lot of things unsaid, and I have had people criticize me for it. So being like, listen, you gotta tell me shit sometimes. So I did really try in this first chapter to give more information, right? And immediately you can see that from the scene where when she says, do you know who I am? In the first draft, narration, Clarienne Sillois, there was no one in Meridi that didn't. Technically, Quill wasn't part of Meridi anymore, so he could pretend that didn't apply to him. So, okay, we get from this that he used to be part of this country, but he isn't anymore, so you could kind of infer that something happened. Exile, in this case. Well, it gets confirmed very quickly, but, you know. And in this new draft, Clarienne Sillois, not a single soul in Ithalin, perhaps in the entire country of Meridi, didn't know his former mentor. So, whilst I kind of take out this line about him not belonging to Meridi anymore, because it presents the information in a little bit of a clunky way where I'm not entirely sure why he thinks that. It's like, technically he didn't belong to Meridi anymore, so he could pretend it didn't apply to him. Like, okay, that doesn't really make sense if you already knew her, you know? Like, it's kind of like, if you think about it for 1 second, it kind of loses sensibility, so I remove that line, because we get this information very quickly. Instead, I say what I don't think I ever say in the first chapter of the first draft, is that this woman is his former mentor, which is important to know, because their relationship is important. So she leaves him be because he's not talking to her, because he's kind of pissed, and he goes on to explore his surroundings. Okay, now I want to look at one Small paragraph just to show you how I can convey the same amount of information in a way shorter way. Have it your way. Once you're ready to talk, we will. Heels clicked across the floor away from him until a door closed with a soft thud, plunging Quill into a still quiet. He let himself huff then. Of course you would assume he was faking the unresponsiveness. Anyone else would guess it was shock, a lingering effects of dying, and perhaps she did. Perhaps it was merely to rile him up on the off chance he was pretending. Regardless, it got her out of the room, and that was all that mattered. A personal little victory. He reveled in it until the itching beneath his skin reached a breaking point and he couldn't lay still anymore. Have it your way. When you're ready to talk, we will. Heels clicked across the floor away from him. A door closed with a soft thud, plunging him into a ringing quiet. Quill reveled in his small victory, however short-lived it be, but the itching restlessness under his skin reached a breaking point and he could no longer ignore it. Again, I removed the part about him thinking, oh, maybe she's just assuming I'm faking or whatever, because it's not very... I mean, it's kind of meant to characterize her a little, but I don't think it's very necessary. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I could keep it, but I feel like you can get the same kind of feeling without me specifically pointing it out. Have it your way. Once you're ready to talk, we will. So she does assume that he's just choosing not to talk to her rather than being unable to, which I think that's enough to get across the idea that they have history with each other and she knows that he's very stubborn. So that's kind of like, it kind of gets across the same kind of information. So I don't, again, it's nothing wrong with it, but if I'm trying to keep this as short as I can, then, I don't know, like, additional information kind of needs to go. So again, I'm gonna be doing quite a bit of reading here, but just so that you know what I'm talking about. With the receding fatigue, other sensations gradually returned. That was all well and good, except it also meant his nonchalance was being chipped away. Besides the initial frustration, which was quickly beginning to crystallize into specific grievances, deep confusion bloomed at what was even happening here. The reasons, the methods, the consequences. Twinges of panic at just how in the dark he was sparked all over. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad, perhaps it wouldn't take much to find answers, but if Clarion Silvois was in charge... Once Quill was able to more or less move his body, which took a significant amount of effort considering how weak and stiff everything was, he got to exploring his surroundings. The first thing he discovered was a small cabinet by the bed, on top of which lay singular item, his glasses. He reached for them, and that was when he discovered the second thing, his left prosthetic arm was missing. Sorry, I just think it's kind of stupid. You know, sometimes I'm like, I didn't read this far along, I'm like, how do you miss that? I think you would notice, so just anyway. In fact, besides the glasses, nothing on his body was his own, as the clothes he wore were patient robes. It was more than usual for unconscious bodies to be handled however others wished, but at that realization, nausea sparked strong enough that he almost doubled over. He gripped the sheets, trying to calm his racing heart. It was fine. He was fine. He wouldn't linger on this. That'd be stupid, considering all the other things he could focus on. And then he just kind of, again, looks around, makes deductions that it's a very fancy room. We don't get really any concrete information out of this, except that, okay, so he doesn't know what happened, which is obvious, and he doesn't even think about what had transpired before, so we get no information. Like, we are completely in the dark. And I don't want the reader to be that much more in the dark than the point of view character. Like, obviously there has to be some mystery here, but at this point, like, we should know a bit more about what had happened, just so we're not as lost. Also, he notes that his prosthetic arm was missing along with his ring, and we have no information in regards to why that ring is important. So now compare that to current draft. So he reveled in the victory, but he has to get up. His prosthetic arm missing, Quill managed to pull himself up with one arm, heaving from exertion. So it's just kind of immediately there. He's missing a prosthetic arm. He doesn't notice it later, he knows it immediately. A profound stiffness held his body in its clutches. With blurred vision, He felt around and discovered a nightstand by the bed where he found his glasses. No ring though. Not that he'd expected to get his magia conduit back so easily. So I just say the exact same fucking thing when he finds his glasses in a couple of sentences instead of it all being a whole fucking paragraph. And also mentions that no ring though. Not that he'd expected to get his magia conduit back so easily. So that's relevant. It's a magia conduit. It doesn't get explained at this present moment what that is, but it's something to do with magic. And I guess like the conduit part kind of implies what it is, but you know. The clothes he wore too weren't his. A dizzying nausea surged at the thought of a stranger addressing him, of handling his body however they wished, because his body had been dead. He gripped the sheets, trying to calm his racing heart. Focus. He needed to focus. He had to treat his resurrection like just another magical phenomena. Again, I get the same information across, and I focus more on his like sensations. He thinks about a stranger undressing him, of handling his body, right? Which is more evocative than just, it was more than usual for unconscious bodies to be handled however others wished, but at that realization, nausea spiked. So it's kind of like this is more presented as a fact that unconscious bodies are being handled. Whereas in the present draft, he actively is in the situation, so it's closer to his experience. One other thing I want to point out, because I think it's interesting, in the first draft, we have like this other character, his former mentor, Clarion Syllois. And in the first draft, he refers to her as Clarion, whereas in the current draft, he calls her Mistress Syllois. So this is another way for me to have a closer point of view. So because I'm alternating between third-person limited point of view and third-person deep, I want the narration to reflect how this main character views the world and himself and others. So how would he refer to his former mentor? Because he always called her by her title and surname, I want the same to be in the narration. Like, I wouldn't just call my boss by his first name, right? And I wouldn't do the same in my head. So that's kind of the same logic. So it's kind of similar with his mother. So like, he never calls her by her name in the narration. He calls her his mother. Because in my head, I never call my mom by her first name. That's kind of how I use other characters' names to show what the relationship is with the main character. So it's kind of similarly in later chapters, we have the other character, Andra, and he starts off by referring to Quill in his narration as Quillen, because that's his kind of full name. And later, when they are more acquainted, he starts referring to him as Quill, which shows that their relationship has changed and it's become more familiar. So yeah, so again, he's looking around where he is, kind of assessing his surroundings. If Mr. Syllois was housing him, she would also want privacy. Could this be her estate in Ethelin? Quill's heart clenched at the thought. Mr. Syllois, Ethelin. These two pieces of information were enough to sketch out a probable theory. Quill gripped his stiff hair and closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. Last memory he had was of, death. Yes, all right, obviously, but before that, Andra. Yes, Andra. Terrified, incoherent, but healthy Andra. Or, no, not entirely, only relatively, because despite his best efforts, all Quill could do was fucking relatively. But then what? What happened with Andra after? No, he'd focus on that later. Now his current circumstances took priority. How rare. After he'd died, the doctors must have reached out to the mage community, considering his strange but clearly magical cause of death. Word must have traveled to Mr. Syllois, who would have recognized its true abnormality. Pure magia poisoning. How fascinating. Such a death had to be the first in history, given how pure magia couldn't, according to all established theory, interact with humans. So, of course, she'd brought his body back to Ethelin for extensive study. Okay, great. Now, how do we get from being yet another scientifically interesting corpse to sitting here, breathing and feeling and undoubtedly living? Again, I don't tell you what happened exactly, but I do give you some information for you to kind of form a vague understanding. So he died from pure magia, right? Whatever that is. We just know that it shouldn't be possible. So clearly something happened that made his death very strange and unique. And his mentor would have recognized this uniqueness and brought his body back to studying. Okay, we don't know how he got this poisoning, but we immediately are told what he died from, right? And so it's about figuring out what that even is, and that happens throughout the story, right? Also, you will notice that I'm already talking Andra, which is the deuteragonist and is central to the story and specifically Quill's inner conflict, right? So he immediately is thinking about Andra when he thinks about what happened, because he's very relevant to what happened. Whereas in the first draft, Andra isn't introduced very soon. He is introduced in the first chapter, but it happens a bit later. So I kind of want to immediately establish what is important to the main character. And, Andrew is important to him. So now the next part that I want to look a bit closer at. When Quill is undressing, he notices there are enchantments on his chest. And this is how he talks about it in the first draft. Was there nothing sacred to Clarion anymore? First necromancy and now human enchanting? While Quill was no expert in this field, he recognized some familiar sigils which indicated a binding of some sort. From there, it didn't take a genius to guess as to what purpose it served, especially on someone like Quill in a place like this. He dug the heel of his shaking palm into his singing eye. How dare she use his body for her whims? How fucking dare she? Quill dropped his arm with a quick inhale and exhale, blinking away the haziness. Fine. He was fine. Sure, the glimmering sigils made him want to claw his skin off with his bare fingers and nothing else, but the general feeling wasn't unfamiliar. How many years had he gone through with a body he wished to crawl out of more than anything else? If he'd managed to mold it to himself, eventually, surely he would be able to deal with this without freaking out about it too. A temporary issue, that was all it was. He'd leave this place, find Florin, he'd break the enchantment, and his body would be his again. Quill didn't know what terms they were on after everything, but Florin wouldn't refuse him, not for something like this. He could only hope his interest in this macabre field hadn't dwindled since their academy days. So, what information do we get from this? He's very unhappy. He's very unhappy that he has an enchantment on him. And it's some sort of binding enchantment, so we can assume it's meant to keep him contained to some place. He thinks that the feeling of wanting to claw his skin off is not unfamiliar, and that he spent many years in a body that he wished to crawl out of. So if he solved that, he could solve this too. So again, this implies things. If you pick up on it, you pick up on it. If you don't, you don't. But most people did pick up on it. And then we are introduced kind of to Florin, and we get that they knew each other since their academy days. So it's probably a past course mate. We don't really get a sense for their relationship because Quill remarks that Quill didn't know what terms they were on after everything, whatever that might be, but Florin wouldn't refuse him, not for something like this. So we don't really get a sense for what the relationship is like. Now, compare it to this current draft. Was nothing secret to Mr. Silwa anymore? First necromancy, now human enchanting? While Quill was no expert in the field, he could recognize some sigils indicating a binding, and, with Quill's predicament, it wasn't difficult to guess its purpose. He dug the heel of his palm into his stinging eye. How dare she use his body for her whims? How fucking dare she? Quill dropped his arm with a shaky breath. Fine. He was fine. Sure, the glimmering sigils made him want to claw his skin off, but the feeling wasn't unfamiliar. How long had he lived in a body he'd wished to crawl out of? If he'd managed to solve that issue, surely he'd work this out too. Uninvited, the thought of Florin rose to mind. No, Quill couldn't go to him, but who else he knew specialized in human enchanting? Considering how damnable the practice was, few advertised themselves. Elf Florin wouldn't refuse him. Not now, not ever. For you, anything. Fuck, he'd consider it later. As always, do you never bore of your own predictability? The first part, we get the same information. Kind of says the same thing, just in a shorter way again. And then, with Florin, we don't get the information that they are past course mates, but we get more of a feeling of how Quill views Florin, right? And again, it's still vague, but I think it kind of gives you a general idea for what their relationship might be, because Quill doesn't want to go to Florin. Whatever happened made him hesitant to reach out to him. But he also doesn't know anyone else who could probably help him with this. And Florin wouldn't refuse him, not now, not ever, for you anything. So this shows that Florin probably has a different view towards Quill, because this is a quote from him, kind of. So he's kind of like, for you, baby, anything. So we get the same thing, that something happened, and that their relationship is probably now different from what it was before. And whereas in the first draft, we get the information that they were in the academy together, here I feel like it's kind of, again, more in his head, and gives you a better feel for how he views this person. I want the reader to feel closer to this character and feel what he's feeling. And so I need to consider how he would think about these people, right? And what kind of emotions that would invoke. That's kind of what I focus more when I'm writing later drafts. Just like, okay, I have all the information. Now, how do the characters feel about this? So he goes to the window, looks outside, and sees the city beyond, right? And I want to kind of compare the descriptions of the city just to show you how kind of I decided to change the focus point. The view outside momentarily stunned him. Below, a golden cityscape stretched far into the horizon, almost blinding in its radiance. Twin spires, one slightly shorter, towered in its center, the rest of the buildings surrounding it in spirals, as if a dazzling hurricane frozen in time, all leading to the towers in its eye. He could almost hear the buzz in the streets, never quieting, and the people refused to ever pause in their lives, always in a hurry, but at least never bored. He could imagine all too well the gentle yellow light that would illuminate the streets throughout the night, more familiar to him than sunlight, and the odd sort of comfort it could bring, never flickering, never leaving anyone in the dark. Here I focus more on the general feel of the city, and I give kind of a vibe for what it's like and how familiar Quill is with it, which is important, that is relevant. He, is attached to this city. But I mentioned twin spires, and I never mentioned what they are. Like, we learned that later. And compare that now to the current draft. So he goes to the window, eager to turn his thoughts in any other direction. And turn they did. Beyond, a golden city landscape stretched into the far horizon. In its center, giant twin spires towered, one slightly shorter, the sunrise's light reflecting off their needle-sharp arched roofs. The rest of the city huddled around them like they were the eye of a hurricane. Nothing but the most sublime for the Margot Seal Academy, nothing but constant spotlight. Impossible to miss, impossible to ignore, be blinded by its grandness for all the architects care. May no one wake up a single day without gazing upon it, may no one forget what Ethan was built upon, may no one ever doubt the legend. So here I don't really focus much on the city and the feel of it, and rather I focus on these spires, which I'm telling you that it's the Academy. Margot Seal Academy. And given that Quill has a former mentor, he's very science-oriented, you can kind of assume that's his alma mater. And by bringing more attention to this academy, I kind of tell you that this is what's most important to him in this city. This is what his life was about, right? So instead of focusing on the streets and the people, I focus more on the academy. So it's just like neither of these are kind of bad. Like neither of these are worse than the other. It's just a matter of what is most important to the character in this place. And in this specific place, it's not the overall city, but rather it's the academy in the city. Like, I focus on the city more when he actually goes out, so it kind of like, we still get a sense that it's important to him, but I first want to establish the kind of order of priorities. This is the part where I add a lot more information than I did in the first draft. Truly, the more time passed, the clearer his situation became. I wouldn't say so, but okay. They took away his death, they took away his body, and they took away his magic. The three things that they hadn't taken before. And now they taunted him. Made sure he knew exactly how much respect he still had, how much they'd considered him a person. First of all, we don't know who they are. They took away, they did that, they did that. Who? It's unclear. I don't mention it in this draft. in this version, I don't mention who they are. They needed him for something. That was the only reason he was alive again. Of that he was certain. But he'd been left alone for years, so clearly something must have changed. Something must have happened between his death and now. Something that would have made Clarion Salwa herself resort to a feat of necromancy previously unimaginable. But they also created no illusion that Quill would have a choice in the matter. This time he did laugh, a breathy, barely audible sort of thing. The audacity. He leaned against the wall and slowly slid it down, his weakened legs unable to hold him up any longer. Giggles kept bubbling up, strange even to his own ears, but oh, wasn't this a development? Hadn't he been naive to think that if he conceded, if he played by their rules, they'd let him go, that they'd hold up their end of the sentence if he held up his? Well, a voice whispered at the back of his head, once more sounding awfully like his mother, you didn't exactly hold it up, did you? No, he didn't. Perhaps that was what they believed gave them the right to drag him back and chain him down like some dog. Perhaps that was what they believed gave them the rights to whatever Quill had to offer. Too bad. He'd already died for his crimes, something they'd called for in the beginning anyway. He had no plans to entertain them any further. This doesn't tell us anything really. It's just there's a vague they. If there were some rules, they were supposed to let him go. There was some sentence that they were supposed to hold up to if he held up to. He didn't hold up to his end of the sentence, whatever that was. It's just too vague. It's just too vague. I don't understand what's happening. I don't know what any of this means. So this is something that I really had to focus on in all my rewrites. Give more information. Just be clearer about what's happening. Like, I don't need to make everything into a mystery. So, compare it to the current draft. He leaned against the wall and slid down. Against his will, breathless laughter wrenched its way out of his stinging throat. Oh, this was perfect. Had he been naive to believe, if he abided by his exile without a whisper of protest, Ethelyn would let him go. He'd ignored the Academy's warnings to cease experimenting with human transmutation. They'd exiled him for it. Fine. That time, he'd listened. He'd followed their orders to shut down his research. Well, that's not quite true, is it? The experiments he did outside Mary's borders shouldn't have mattered. And even if they had, shouldn't his death have been the ultimate punishment? Unless they wouldn't want to punish him for it. Unless the study he did on Andra's affliction was the reason behind this resurrection. Quill laid a hand above his suddenly racing heart, trying to inhale. Calm down. Even if his conclusion was right, they didn't have to mean anything. He could play stupid, pretend he had no idea what they were talking about, or better yet, fake amnesia. His brain had been dead after all. Who could tell what side effects revival would have? He'd been determined to take all he'd learned about Andra's affliction to the grave, and he intended to keep true to his word. Unless Mr. Silwa had proof. Unless she had Andra. Quill sprang to his feet, ears pounding. He barely stopped himself from sprinting to the door because some part of his mind was still sane and realized how absolutely idiotic that'd be. All he had were his paranoid thoughts, and if by some miracle Mr. Silwa didn't have any proof, Andra, he'd tell on himself by demanding to know. No, what he had to do was figure out her intentions without giving his own away. The moment he confirmed what she wanted from him had nothing to do with Andra, he'd refused to entertain her for a second more. So, let's compare. Immediately, what do we learn? The Academy warned him to stop experimenting with human transmutation. He didn't, and he got exiled for it. Immediately, that's something we don't get in the first draft, right? So he did human transmutation, that was bad, and he got exiled for it. Okay. His conditions were that he would stop experimenting with human transmutation whilst in exile. And he didn't stop experimenting. In fact, he continued doing his experiments. We're not sure what they were exactly, but they had to do with human transmutation. And specifically, it had to do with Andra's affliction. Again, we don't know what it is, but we get the information that Andra was sick. We already know that Andra is important to him, and Andra was there when he died. And specifically, Quill remarked that Andra was healthy. Not completely, but relatively. So this has to do with the same kind of information. Like, we just get additional context. That specifically, Andra was afflicted. Quill was doing human transmutation on him to alleviate him of the condition. And the Academy might be interested in the study he did on Andra's affliction, which really stresses him out. He then immediately considers, oh, maybe they already know what I did on Andra. Maybe they found him. Maybe something happened. That immediately establishes what is most important to him. So he doesn't care as much about him as he does about Andra and what might have happened to him. So that's a whole lot more information. And again, I could be maybe clearer even more, but I feel like it's kind of enough for you to get a general understanding of what happened without giving too much away. So in the second scene, Mistress Sylva returns and they have a little chat. And again, the main difference between these drafts are how much information we are given. It starts off rather similarly. She questions how he's feeling. If he wants something to drink, he's not answering her still because he's being a little bit of a bitch about it. So it kind of continues in a similar manner. Again, the conversation is very similar. But here, Quill is just being a bitch, right? And in this current draft, he is considering, okay, how do I lead the conversation towards what she wants from me without seeming desperate? So when she asks, like, I mean, you know ill will, how can I prove it to you? So he's like, okay, let's ask reasonable things first without just immediately jumping to what I want to know. So it kind of gives more intention, like it gives him a goal in this scene. Whereas in the first draft, he's just kind of like, well, I guess he does have a goal of like, okay, what's happening? What do you want from me? You know? But here, there's also that, in addition to having this goal of figuring out whether Andra is somehow involved, which is what's most important to him. So to compare this kind of like how this conversation progresses, right? She asks him, Clarion asks him in both versions, I mean you kind of know ill will, what do you want as proof? So in draft 1, as a show of goodwill, I won't ask you any more questions today. Instead, how about I answer some of yours? Quill scrunched up his face at her. As a show of goodwill, he gestured to his left shoulder. You could give my arm back. So the first thing that he asks of her is like, give me back my arm. And in comparison, in the current draft, she asks him, I mean, you know ill will, how can I prove it to you? You can start by telling me how I'm even here. How am I not... He cut himself off, unable to finish that nausea-inducing question. So the first thing he asks her when he gets the opportunity to is like, how am I alive? I feel like that's a bit more relevant. I feel like that would be a more reasonable thing to ask about, which he doesn't ask actually in this first draft, which is, I didn't realize that, which gives me the opportunity to kind of shut it down immediately because it's a mystery. I'm not gonna answer it in the first chapter, okay? But by ignoring the question in general, it just makes him look a little weird. So I immediately address it. And she answers, I'm afraid that's confidential information. What? How could it be confidential from me? An odd question. Being a subject doesn't automatically grant you the privilege of knowing sensitive information. You didn't go around explaining your procedure to your subjects, did you? She asked. You simply don't have the status necessary to know. What absolute bullshit. He knew it, she knew it, and he could do nothing about it. She was only keeping the cards he so desperately wanted away in case she had a need for them later. So he asks her how am I alive. She's like, that's confidential. Which, I mean, I guess, listen, it can make sense. Like, if he's the subject, it doesn't... Yeah, so this is kind of like how I explain why he can't just know. And then he continues asking, okay, well, how much time has passed? Can I at least know that? She tells him it's almost been a year, 11 months. Who else is aware of your death? Not many. We kept it only to the relevant mages in your family. Why the secrecy? Had you planned to revive him from the start? No, certain circumstances arose that forced our hand. Anyway, and then he asks about his ring. Magia conduit, like, okay, well, when can I get that back? And she says, oh, your ring wasn't on you when we found you. And now is when we get the introduction to Andra in the first draft. Quill remarks that he had it when he died. He was certain of that, but then could Andra have taken it? What for? He didn't need a Magia conduit, so what use would he have with quills? A harrowing, dreadful feeling hissed to life, burrowed beneath his skin, seeping through him to the marrow of his bones, and Quill had to exert great effort to keep his face and posture still. A memento. That was the most likely reason. Essentially, he just thinks about, like, oh, Andra probably took his ring as a memento, something to remember Quill by. It's kind of similar in both versions. It's just, again, worded a bit differently to have a bit of a bigger impact, I would say, in the current version. But the difference is that in this version, he, after thinking, oh, he must have taken it as a memento. And then a jolt of realization shot through him. If Mistress Silhouette didn't know where his conduit was, and if Andra was the only one who could have it, they hadn't met. Unless, of course, she's anticipated, he'd make this conclusion and had strategically lied about his conduit, but I'd be too convoluted even for her. So he breathed, shoulders slumping minutely. Okay, crisis averted. Okay, so this is how he kind of makes the conclusion that, okay, Andra isn't here. She doesn't know about Andra, so he's probably fine. From this point on, he's just kind of like, I don't care. I know my lover is fine, probably, and you have nothing on me. And now we get kind of to the end. So this first draft ends a little quicker because I don't really get to the whole point of their conversation. I keep it for a later chapter, just to kind of show you that. He asks, like, okay, in this first draft, he asks, like, okay, like, so when can I leave? And she's like, that's up to you, Quillen. If we establish a mutually beneficial relationship, your stay here will not be prolonged. Mutually beneficial? What a joke. Your skepticism is understandable, but there truly is no quicker resolution to this than cooperation. Oak will believe that. Issue was, he wasn't in a particularly cooperative mood. Again, they have a bit of a back and forth. It's pretty similar to the current version, where he's like, listen, lady, you've made a mockery out of my body, and you expect me to work with you? Go fuck yourself, you know. She remarks about those certain circumstances which arose that forced their hand. So he remarks, and yet you kept my body in pristine condition. The question was implied. Quillen. I'm sure you can figure out why. This is where he kind of remarks how his death was strange, his death was weird, and it was a metaphorical goldmine for any scholar researching magic types. So we get kind of the information that his death was unique in some way, but we don't really get anything more than that. And he's like, and was your curiosity satisfied? Hardly, Clarion remarked. We were hoping you could offer some insight into it, actually. Well, that's unfortunate. But that is my business alone. If you failed to get enough information out of me when I was dead, you certainly won't get more now. Quillen, I'm tired, Miss Silwa. I'd appreciate it if you let me rest now. You seem to be very concerned with my stability after all. So, and that's kind of how it ends. She's like, alright. Yeah, I'll leave now. You rest. I will chat again next time. And then later when she leaves, he thinks about, like, okay, so what does she want from me? He thinks, a year. A lot can happen in that long. Whatever Clarion needed him for had to become relevant in that time frame. She hadn't bothered him for years. What could have changed in mere months? He dropped his arm with a sigh. He needed a game plan here. Clarion knew he wanted this information, and that was the issue. She wouldn't be inclined to get it away for free, even if it benefited her, not when she could use it to milk as much out of him as she could. So he'd have to be smart about this, play his hand carefully. Regardless of anything, she needed him, and that was his best card. He'd make it work. Somehow he would. This isn't necessarily a bad way to end the chapter, because he's kind of like, okay, you could see how that could make sense. She's like, she wants something from him, but they're kind of playing games, if you will. But it doesn't really give the reader much to go off of. And so this is the current version. So let's go back to when she says, I would like for us to establish a mutually beneficial relationship, after which you would be free to do whatever you wished. And again, they have the similar back and forth, and he's like, you would treated me with less esteem than a master would their dog. I find that line pretty funny. Please tell me how you expect me to look past that enough to work with you. So then she's like, please do not pretend your case isn't unique. Still, I implore you to reserve your judgment for when you're more familiar with the situation at hand. And finally, we get to the point of this chapter. Quill wished to implore her to do many things, but he was raised with manners. Fine. What do you want from me then? She cleared her throat. I have a proposition for you. See, we've recently come into possession of something potentially revolutionary. It concerns a unique kind of animagicnesses, and the topmost experts in the field have already been gathered. Few, however, can rival your own expertise. And such, I would like to offer you the following. Join our research team, provide that expertise, help us reach our goals, and for your efforts, you will be granted amnesty. Quill stared at her, dead silent. You cannot be serious. I am. Ethelin's council has already agreed to it. All that is left is for you two. Quill gripped the cup in a vain attempt to control the building tremble. He tried to breathe once, twice, but his chest refused to rise, his vision blurring. The white-hot ire spucking through his veins threatened to burn them. I really am no more than a dog to you, he whispered, if you've managed to delude yourself into believing I'll be at your beck and call like one. Mr. Silwa's nails drummed on the table. This isn't an opportunity many get. Your crimes would be forgiven, and you could once more be amongst your own, where you belong. I assure you, another chance like this will not arise. An opportunity, he laughed, incredulous. Oh, why put up this farce? You already own my life. Say you'll take it away if you don't comply, and that's that. Or would it kill you to be honest for once in your life? If you choose to decline my offer, you will return to exile. Nothing more, nothing less. It would be foolish for you to, of course. You have nothing to lose if you accept. Nothing to lose. Right. What a joke. Which was what he was to her. Get out, he said. She shut her eyes, opened them. Quillen, he stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. Get out. She stared at him before rising. Momentarily, she was perfectly composed once more, hands clasped in front of her. Take time to consider my proposal. Truly consider. We'll talk when you've calmed down. With that, she twirled around and crossed the room, the door's thud lingering in the silent room. Quill breathed, once, twice. Red assaulted his vision, and he grabbed the cup, hurling it against the wall. It shattered upon impact, leaving behind dark stains of tea, and only barely did Quill not echo the sound with his own screaming. Was he supposed to run back to them, like some starved animal at the slightest whiff of forgiveness? He knew it was nothing more than a valuable toy. He knew, but the bitter ache didn't care. She was wrong. He didn't belong here. He hadn't for a long while, and nothing could change that. They may not have signed on his execution sentence at the end, opting for the more merciful option, but he had in all the ways that mattered. And she could be downed for all he cared. That's how the first chapter ends in the current version. That gives you way more information about what's going on. So the reason why Mr. Silwa is here is to offer Quill the opportunity to earn back amnesty. She has some sort of research project for which she wants his expertise. And Quill is very upset by her, as much as suggesting the idea. So we have already established that, okay, Entra isn't involved here, so he knows that she probably doesn't have anything over him, except this idea of like, oh, you could earn back amnesty, which in this whole chapter he hasn't thought about. So it's clearly not something that's very important to him. Instead, he focuses more on whatever happened between them in the past, which made him very upset with her and very unwilling to work with her again. So his reaction is much stronger and much more emotional than in the first draft, for which we don't really get a reaction to anything. He's just kind of like, I'm tired, so leave. And she's like, okay, I'll come back later. And it's kind of like, that's how kind of it ends. And here we get this very strong, like, emotion of anger, of rage, of unfairness, if you will. And it's kind of, we end the chapter with like, okay, so we know what is kind of happening. Like, we kind of have the context for Quill's situation, but how will it go from here? Because, well, you can kind of assume that he probably is going to get involved in this research project, but we are told that he absolutely does not want to, and she doesn't really have anything to hold over him so that he would agree. So what happens after this? I feel like it's a more interesting first chapter than the first drafts, because by giving the reader more information, we are able to present questions that would keep them engaged rather than just make them confused. Because in the first draft, it's just a lot of vague he vaguely did something, he was vaguely exiled. There's Andra, who we don't know anything about. Like, okay, he was there when Quill died, and that is it. Whereas in the current version, we know that Andra had some sort of affliction. Quill was helping him with it, and he probably succeeded in some way. It involved human transmutation, and he thinks that Mr. Silwa and the Academy would be interested in the study that he did on Andra's affliction. So already we have a lot more context. And when he figures out that, oh, Andra probably isn't involved here, he's just kind of like, okay, so you have nothing. You have nothing. I don't want to be here. I hate all of you. It's just packed more tightly. It gives you more context for what's happening. It gives you more feelings. It's more in Quill's head. I think it's more evocative. It focuses more on his feelings about the situation, about the people that he knows, about Mr. Silwa. And especially like at the end, like he's not a violent person. Like he's never aggressive or anything. And yet the preposition that Mr. Silwa gives him is enough for him to fucking throw things around. Clearly, this upset him a lot. Clearly, he doesn't want to be here. So, knowing that and assuming he's gonna continue being here, it raises the question of, okay, so how does he actually get involved in this? So, it's just kind of like, okay, this is what he cares about, this is what he does not care for, and it just kind of establishes his goals and motivations a bit clearer. And so, when they go into the second chapter, when we continue where I left off, and we get to see, okay, what does actually happen for him to get involved, we already have a lot of context for what's important to him. So when he gets involved, we can understand why. That's kind of like my sort of a bit of an analysis of how I constructed the beginning of this particular story versus like the first draft and how much I changed and what I improved upon. So you will see that the events haven't changed. The two scenes are the same, kind of, right? There's no new characters, there's nothing new happens. It's just conversation and what we glean from that and what we glean from how Quill thinks about his situation. And just from that, by adding no additional action, no additional anything, we can make the chapter both shorter, clearer, more to the point, and hopefully more engaging. I don't know, this is kind of, it's a little all over the place, this video, but I thought it would be interesting for me too, to just see for myself that if first drafts, they're just meant to exist. They are not meant to be perfect. They're not meant to be even good. They just need to have the sustenance necessary for me to build upon it. It's just nice to see, okay, I can improve, it's fine. It's fine, the first draft doesn't mean anything. Again, same things worded differently gives you a whole other result. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found this interesting. I do really like looking at my past works and seeing how I improved, seeing how I can still improve. And I'm thinking maybe I could do a similar thing where I rework some of my other old stories into a bit more, readable, a bit more engaging. I don't know, because I do have like several unfinished first drafts from years ago. So that would be interesting to look at. If you want to read the full first chapter, which I analyzed today, you can sign up to my newsletter and get the chapter for free. If you want to see the full thing of like, okay, what did they talk about? So yeah, hope you enjoyed. Do let me know what you thought. If you have any thoughts, please subscribe. And I will see you next time. So bye.